Congresswoman, are you even prepared to answer this question? The words cut through the chamber with a sting, sharp and dripping with smugness. Judge Amiel Thapar leaned back ever so slightly, his tone not just interrogative but performative, as if the question itself were a weapon. The silence that followed was thick. Cameras captured every twitch of his face, every ounce of condescension in his voice. For a split second, it seemed as though the room had tilted in his favor. But then, the freeze. Jasmine Crockett did not flinch, did not fumble, did not blink. Her eyes locked onto him with a piercing intensity that shattered the judges. Theater of authority. It wasn't just a look. It was the unspoken signal of a woman who had heard this tone her entire life, the tone of people, who believed they were entitled to her silence. The air grew electric. Observers leaned forward. Staffers glanced at each other. The weight of history hung between them. An immigrant-rooted America versus an old guard. Trying to reassert control, the narrator's voice rises. This was no ordinary exchange. This was a test, an ambush staged in front of the nation. And what followed in that chamber would leave millions speechless. Thapar shifted in his chair, clearly convinced he had set the trap. To him, Crockett was just another politician to corner, another target to humble with the authority of his robe and his reputation. But the judge had underestimated the resolve seated before him. Crockett's silence wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. And in that pause, she seized control of the moment. A flashbulb popped. A reporter scribbled furiously. Every second stretched into eternity, as if the entire country were holding its breath. The smug grin across Thapar's face seemed to widen, but beneath it lay a subtle tremor, the uneasy premonition of a man about to be exposed. For Crockett, this wasn't just about answering a question. It was about answering for every moment. She, and countless others, had been told to know their place. The chamber walls seemed to close in, stakes towering higher with each heartbeat. But Crockett wasn't just ready. She was about to deliver a takedown no one saw coming. To understand why this moment carried such weight, you have to see. Beyond the chamber walls, on one side sat Judge Amiel Thapar, a conservative voice of the federal bench. Handpicked by power brokers who admired his sharp tongue and his willingness to play enforcer in contentious hearings, his reputation wasn't simply that of a jurist, it was that of an intimidator. Someone who thrived on cornering witnesses, unraveling their arguments with rapid-fire questions, and leaving them stammering before the cameras. To his supporters, he was incisive. To his critics, he was a bully with a robe, and across from him sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a first-term representative whose path to that chamber looked nothing like his. A daughter of working-class grit, a lawyer who had fought for ordinary people long before she ever touched a microphone in Washington. Crockett was known for being bold, unfiltered, and unapologetically herself. Her critics sneered that she was too loud or too emotional. Her supporters knew better. She was fearless in places where fear was the norm. But because she didn't carry the polish of elite prep schools and insider networks, she was often underestimated, especially by men like Thapar, mistook authenticity for weakness. Asterisk. That miscalculation is what made this clash inevitable. The tension wasn't just about a question in a hearing. It was about two worlds colliding, authority wrapped in arrogance versus authenticity rooted in lived experience. Thapar's power rested on tradition, hierarchy, and the expectation of deference. Crockett's power rested on her refusal to be boxed in by those very traditions. To the judge, the hearing was his stage. To Crockett, it was a battlefield where the voices of those unheard demanded representation. The cameras captured every second. Journals knew this was bigger than a procedural exchange. It was theater, politics, and identity all rolled into one. Social media was already buzzing. Clips of Thapar's opening salvo circulating with captions like, "Watch Judge humble Congresswoman Crockett," or "This won't end well for her." The expectation was almost universal that Thapar would land the knockout. After all, that's what he was known for, but something was different this time. Crockett wasn't rattled. She wasn't scrambling for words or searching for approval. She sat steady, calm, letting the judge's bravado echo into emptiness. That composure alone began to shift the energy. People watching at home felt it too, the simmering sense that the judge's performance wasn't landing the way he intended. Because here's the truth. Intimidation only works when the other side accepts. The role of the intimidated. Crockett never signed up for that role. The stakes then weren't just about one woman facing down one judge. They were about who gets to claim authority in America's most hallowed halls. Do titles and robes guarantee supremacy? Or can authenticity, rooted in truth and conviction, cut through the arrogance of those who assume their superiority? The chamber was a stage, yes, but it was also a mirror reflecting back the struggle so many Americans know intimately. The fight to be heard against those who would rather silence them. And so, as Judge Thapar leaned further into his performance, convinced he was tightening the noose, the trap began to turn against him. His arrogance blinded him to the shift underway. He thought Crockett was cornered. He thought she had nowhere left to go, and just when it seemed the judge had her boxed in, everything flipped. Amul Thapar did not stumble into power. His rise was methodical, cultivated, and groomed by a system that prized pedigree over empathy. Born to immigrant parents, he had the advantages of elite education, the kind of credentials that open every door in Washington's most exclusive corridors. He carved out a career that impressed those who believed the bench should be less about justice and more about protecting the status quo. To his admirers, Thapar was the model of discipline and intellect. To those who faced him across a courtroom or a hearing table, he was something else entirely, a man who wielded his knowledge not as a tool for fairness but as a weapon to dominate. On paper, he carried all the markings of respectability, a polished resume, an unshakable confidence, and a polished demeanor that signaled control. Yet beneath that exterior lay something more corrosive, a conviction that authorities should silence dissent. That intimidation was a legitimate form of persuasion. Time and again, he had sharpened this tactic in hearings, where he interrupted, mocked, cornered those who dared to push back against his questions. There were moments etched into the memory of Capitol observers, a witness fumbling through her testimony as Thapar fired question after question with machine-like precision, his tone growing sharper, his smirk growing wider. Another exchange where he needled a young advocate until she visibly broke, pausing mid-sentence with tears welling up in her eyes while the judge reclined in satisfaction. These were the performances that made him a darling of the conservative establishment. They saw his tactics not as cruelty but as strength, a ruthless efficiency in cutting through what they called nonsense. But cruelty wears a mask, and Thapar wore his well. He spoke with polished diction, framed his takedowns with legal precision, and dressed his intimidation in the robes of authority. He believed in his own myth, that his intellect was a sword, his status a shield, and his word a final verdict. And the myth grew stronger each time an opponent buckled under the weight of his tone. Yet the truth was simpler. His power didn't come from brilliance, it came from fear. Thrived on the imbalance of power, on the unspoken assumption that those sitting across from him would inevitably falter. The microphone amplified his authority, but arrogance made him blind to what happens when someone refuses to play by those rules. Behind closed doors, colleagues whispered about his penchant for grandstanding. They noticed how he often turned hearings into performances, how he relished the spectacle of putting others in their place. To the outside world, he was a judge. Inside the chamber, he was an actor who fed on dominance. That's why this confrontation with Jasmine Crockett mattered so much. He approached it the same way. He had approached countless exchanges before with confidence bordering on certainty. In his mind, she was just another opponent to rattle, another voice to diminish with a clever line and a calculated pause. He believed his authority was enough to cow her into submission, but that belief would become his undoing. For arrogance has a fatal flaw. It assumes permanence. It assumes the performance will always work, that the robe will always intimidate, that the polished exterior will always conceal the ego beneath it. And so he leaned into the same playbook, delivering his lines with that familiar smugness, certain the cameras would capture yet another moment of dominance. What he could not see, what he refused to see, was the strength seated across from him. Jasmine Crockett was not the kind of a voice that trembles under pressure. She had walked through fire long before stepping into that chamber. Asterisk. This was not a duel of equals in his mind. He believed the robe alone gave him the advantage, but Crockett had something more potent than titles or robes. She had credibility built on sacrifice, a resilience tempered by struggle, and a defiance that had been tested in fire. For her, this wasn't theater, was truth. For her, this wasn't performance, it was survival. As their eyes locked in that chamber, the imbalance began to shift. Thapar's confidence, so carefully performed, met a quiet force he could not rattle. Crockett didn't need to posture or embellish. Her very presence was enough to challenge his arrogance. She had come too far, endured too much, and represented too many to falter in the face of yet another attempt to diminish her. And so, when Judge Thapar leaned into his performance, when he tried to corner her with the same tactics that had broken so many others, he was not stepping into the familiar territory of dominance. He was stepping into the storm of a woman uniquely prepared for this fight, and when Judge Thapar tried to corner her, he unknowingly stepped into a battle he could never win. The tension inside the chamber was no longer subtle, it was thick, coiling around every word, every pause, every glance. Judge Thapar leaned forward, his voice clipped, calculated, and dripping with condescension. "Congresswoman," he began, the word itself sounding like a warning. "If you've had the time to review the record, perhaps you can explain to this committee why your position makes sense." Or he let the word dangle with theatrical weight. "Is it that you simply don't understand what's before you?" It wasn't just a question. It was an insult dressed as inquiry, a dagger sharpened with tone rather than content. He layered one question atop another, his phrasing deliberately complex, his delivery deliberately quick, as if speed itself could destabilize her. It was the familiar playbook: overwhelm, interrupt, dominate. But Crockett did not flinch. Her hands remained folded neatly before her, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. She allowed him to keep talking, to pile on his questions, his insinuations, his smirks. And with each additional word, the contrast sharpened, grew louder, sharper, more insistent. She grew calmer, more precise, her silence its own rebuttal. Murmurs began in the gallery. Observers shifted in their seats. Porters scribbled notes, sensing the performance had taken on a life of its own. The judge pressed harder. "Tell me, Congresswoman, how can you sit here and claim expertise when your argument collapses under the very statutes you swore to uphold?" He barely gave her space to respond before lobbing the next grenade. "Do you think slogans replace substance? Do you think passion substitutes for knowledge? Because in this chamber facts matter, law matters?" And frankly, he paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room before settling back on her composure matters. It was a masterclass in arrogance. Every syllable delivered with the confidence of a man convinced he was winning. Yet with each question, with each barb, a new tension filled the air, not the tension of Crockett's unraveling, but the tension of his overreach. The more he pressed, the more obvious it became. This wasn't strength. It was desperation disguised as control. Crockett's composure told its own story. She sat still, but her eyes burned with focus. She didn't interrupt. She didn't rush. She let his words echo, filling the room until they grew heavy and hollow. The silence between his volleys became unbearable, a silence that suggested she was not the one under pressure. He was. The audience felt it too. The whispers died down. All eyes were fixed on her, waiting, anticipating. Who would crack first? The judge, restless in his overconfidence, or the Congresswoman, unshaken in her stillness? Asterisk. For a moment, time seemed to stretch thin. The judge leaned back, satisfied that he had cornered her. But Crockett leaned forward ever so slightly, her lips parting, her tone sharp but measured. The calm before a storm, and then with a single phrase Crockett flipped the entire exchange on its head. Her voice came low at first, measured, almost surgical. "Judge Thapar," Crockett said, each syllable deliberate, "I want you to understand something before I answer your question." She paused, letting the silence settle over the chamber. The judge, still smirking, adjusted his robe as if bracing for an easy rebuttal, but the room knew something in her tone signaled that the tide had just turned. You asked if I was prepared. You questioned whether I understood the record. You implied that my passion replaces my knowledge. Let me educate you because, unlike you, I've lived the consequences of the laws you treat like props. The first blow landed clean. A ripple of reaction moved through the gallery, soft gasps, the hurried scratching of pens across notepads. Thapar's smile stiffened. He shifted in his seat, no longer quite so comfortable. Crockett pressed on, her rhythm tightening, her cadence rising like a drumbeat. I've sat across from young men criminalized for being poor, for being black, for being visible in a country that too often treats them as invisible. I've watched prosecutors twist the law into a noose. I've fought in courtrooms where judges who look like you use that robe as a shield for arrogance instead of a tool for justice. And I did not tremble then. I will not tremble now. Another blow. Chamber, once filled with the judge's booming interruptions, was now overtaken by her words. Reporters looked up from their notebooks. Staffers exchanged wide-eyed glances. A low murmur buzzed across the back rows, as though the entire room recognized they were witnessing a shift. Thapar tried to interject. Congresswoman, but Crockett cut through his interruption like a blade. No, you've had your performance. Now the people you dismiss deserve to hear mine. The authority in her tone stunned him into silence. For the first time, the judge looked small, diminished, his attempts at control crumbling in real time. She leaned forward, her hands firm on the table, her eyes locked on him with unwavering intensity. You want to talk about composure? Composure is not a smirk when someone's dignity is at stake. Composure is not an act you rehearse for cameras. Real composure is standing in the fire and refusing to back down, not because it's easy, but because justice demands it. The audience shifted again. Some stifled claps, quickly hushed by decorum. Others whispered audibly, unable to contain their reactions. On social media, the clip was already spreading, hashtags forming, captions declaring, Crockett schooling Thapar, mic drop moment. Thapar's face betrayed him. The smirk had vanished, replaced by tight lips and a faint tremor in his jaw. His hands, once folded with ease, now fiddled with a pen, tapping nervously against the desk. The robe no longer made him made him look like a man hiding behind fabric, exposed by the force of truth. Crockett's pacing slowed, her voice now steady, precise, every word deliberate. She delivered the final blows with the clarity of a closing argument. You sit there believing authority gives you power, but authority without integrity is weakness. You think questions that belittle can diminish me. They cannot, because I do not answer only for myself. Answer for the people who sent me here, people who know what it feels like to be cornered, talked down to, silenced. You do not get to corner me. Not today, not ever. The words hung heavy, echoing in the silence that followed. No one moved. The chamber was suspended in awe. The judge, staring back at her, stripped of the arrogance he had carried so proudly minutes earlier, and then like the sound of a verdict, Crockett leaned back, her gaze unwavering, her voice calm once more. So, Judge Thapar, let me answer your question directly. Yes, I am prepared. More prepared than you ever expected. The room erupted not in applause because protocol forbade it, but in something louder, an undeniable energy. Into audible gasps, staffers could no longer contain their smiles. Reporters' phones lit up with frantic typing, tweets already taking form. The moment was alive, a living thing that stretched far beyond the four walls of the chamber. Thapar's shoulders sank. His eyes darted downward, his pen tapping faster, his jaw clenched tight. His performance was shattered, his dominance dismantled. He had been outmaneuvered not by louder arrogance, but by the steady force of dignity refusing to yield. For Crockett, it was never about theatrics. It was about truth, delivered with precision, armed with experience, carried on behalf of the silenced. She had turned his own arrogance against him, flipping the power dynamic in front of millions watching. It was the political equivalent of a knockout. Blow by blow, she had dismantled his posture, and with her final strike, she left him sitting, In silence, the cameras capturing the unraveling of a man who had believed himself untouchable. The chamber, once dominated by his interruptions, now belonged entirely to her. But the real shockwaves came after she left the chamber. The moment Jasmine Crockett leaned back in her chair, the energy in the chamber shifted like a tide breaking against a seawall. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a recalibration of power. A rare instant when arrogance collapsed in real time and authenticity claimed the spotlight. But the true magnitude of what had happened wasn't confined to that room. The real storm began the moment the clip hit the outside world. Within minutes, the exchange was circulating online. A single phrase, "Yes, I am prepared." More prepared than you ever expected, was clipped, subtitled, and posted on Twitter, TikTok, and at Instagram. It spread like wildfire. Hashtags bloomed. Hashtag Crockett mic drop. Hashtag truth over titles. Hashtag she shut him down. Each replay added fuel to the fire, each share multiplying the reach until millions had seen the takedown within hours. On TikTok, the moment became a sound. Creators layered her words over videos of everyday defiant students challenging unfair school rules, workers speaking up to bosses, parents confronting bureaucrats. Her tone, calm yet lethal, became the anthem of resistance. On Twitter, the clip racked up hundreds of thousands of retweets, paired with captions like "This is how you face arrogance," and "Congresswoman Crockett just schooled a federal judge on live TV." Cable news producers scrambled to recut the footage for evening broadcasts. On MSNBC, commentators called it the takedown of the year. CNN anchors replayed the moment frame by frame, analyzing the body language of Judge Thapar as his composure disintegrated. Even late-night hosts picked it up, weaving the clip into monologues with biting humor. Judge Thapar asked if she was prepared. He didn't realize she brought the whole syllabus. But beyond the laughter, something deeper resonated. Viewers who rarely tuned into congressional hearings suddenly felt seen. Immigrants posted comments about how Crockett's words echoed their own struggles, being underestimated, dismissed, told they didn't belong. Black women, in particular, flooded timelines with messages of solidarity. "We know this stare. We know this silence. We know this fight." And while praise poured in, the ripple effect unsettled her opponents. Conservative commentators scrambled to spin the moment, calling Crockett disrespectful or performative. Yet, their critiques only amplified her visibility, making the clip trend higher. Every attack seemed to prove her point, that powerful institutions often demand silence rather than truth. Inside the Capitol, the whispers were just as telling. Staffers who had witnessed the exchange couldn't stop replaying it in their heads. Some described it as the moment the judge lost the room. Others admitted they'd never seen someone dismantle Thapar so cleanly. Colleagues from across the aisle, even those who disagreed with her politics, quietly acknowledged her poise. It was no longer just about a hearing. It was about what the confrontation symbolized. Crockett wasn't merely standing up for herself, she was standing up for every person who had ever been cornered by condescension and refused to fold. Asterisk, and in living rooms across America, that resonance took root. Parents watched the clip with their children, pointing to her as an example of dignity refusing to be silenced. Students reshared it as inspiration before debates and presentations. Workers whispered about it around office break rooms. "Did you see what Crockett did to that judge?" The power of the moment wasn't just in the exchange, it was in the way it became a story people told each other, a reference point for courage under pressure. But as the clip soared across screens, one question loomed larger. If one congresswoman could dismantle arrogance this effectively in a single chamber, what else could she do with that voice? Because this wasn't just the aftermath of a takedown, this was the beginning of something bigger. Yet beneath the memes and the trending tags, the moment carried a deeper truth. What lingered after the hashtags? After the pundits' commentary? After the laughter of late-night television was something more enduring? Crockett's words had transcended the spectacle. They had cut to the marrow of a truth America too often avoids. Dignity is not granted by titles, robes, or privilege. It is claimed by those who refuse to be silenced. For her supporters, the lesson was unmistakable. Crockett had not just answered a judge. She had answered the centuries-old script of condescension and dismissal aimed at people who look like her, sound like her, and dare to rise in spaces not built for them. She reminded the country that authenticity, sharpened by lived experience, carries a weight no robe, no gavel, no pedigree can erase, and it was not lost on the millions who watched this moment. It was not about ego, it was about representation. When she said, "I answer for the people who sent me here," it was a declaration that her seat belonged to more than one voice. It belonged to the marginalized, the overlooked, the silenced. She turned a courtroom-style interrogation into a stage for democracy itself, where the oppressed could finally hear their truth echoed in power. Her calm dismantling of Thapar's arrogance was more than a clapback. It was a model. It was proof that you can stand in the fire. You can be underestimated. You can face the smirk of authority and still command the room. It was a reminder that strength is not in volume, but in conviction across the nation. Progressive commentators framed it as a parable. Arrogance will always crumble when confronted by truth spoken with courage. Conservative critics, scrambling to reframe it, only amplified the core lesson further. The debate wasn't about whether Crockett had won. The debate was about why her words resonated so deeply with so many. The answer was simple. Because dignity matters. Because integrity matters. Because the people watching immigrants, black women, working families, saw a piece of themselves. In that chair, refusing to bow to intimidation, in that sense, the confrontation became less about Jasmine Crockett versus Emil Thapar, and more about a larger clash. Authenticity versus arrogance, representation versus elitism, justice versus performance. And though the headlines would fade, the moral remained. One voice, steady and unshaken, can redraw the lines of power. And as the chamber's echoes quieted, one final question remained in the air. If this was just one battle, what could happen in the larger war for dignity and justice? This was more than just a viral clip. It was a story of arrogance confronted, of dignity standing tall, of truth breaking through noise. Judge Thapar tried to corner Jasmine Crockett with smug authority, but what he didn't count on was her resilience, her preparation, and her voice, the voice of countless people who refused to be silenced. Moments like these remind us why representation matters. They remind us that when someone like Crockett speaks, she carries generations with her, immigrants, workers, black women, underdogs who have always been told to wait their turn, to lower their eyes, to stay quiet. And she reminds us powerfully that silence is not the only option. So if you felt that spark, if you replayed her words and thought, yes, that's exactly how it feels to stand up to arrogance, then this story is also yours. Share it. Talk about it. Let it be the example you bring into your own battles, big or small. Because Crockett's lesson was never meant to stay confined within four walls of a chamber. It was meant to ripple outward, to remind us all that dignity is stronger than intimidation, and that no robe, no title, no smirk can erase the truth when it's spoken with courage. Asterisk, and here's the truth. You have a role in this story. Every share, every conversation, every time you amplify voices like hers, you help ensure that arrogance does not get the last word. So don't just watch, participate. Subscribe, stay engaged. Be part of a community that refuses to let intimidation define the narrative. Together we keep the spotlight on authenticity, on justice, on dignity. Because in the end, what we witnessed wasn't just Crockett shutting down Thapar. It was a reminder that all of us, when prepared, when unshaken, have the power to do the same.